It's time to bring out the BetterWorldian in all of us. Welcome to BetterWorldians Radio with your hosts, Ray, Mary Sue, and Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio inspires you with the people and ideas that are making the world a better place. You'll hear how small acts can make a big difference every day. Now, here are Ray, Mary Sue, and Gregory.
Hi, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. BetterWorldians Radio is a weekly broadcast whose mission is to uplift and inspire you to make the world a better place. I'm Ray Hansel, joined today by my co-host, Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. Essentially, we believe it's the most important to plant flowers, not just pull weeds. We focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the BetterWorldian in everyone so that we can all make it a better world. Joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio are Harry Halloran and also Tony Carr. We'll be speaking with Harry in the first segment and chatting with Tony after the break. Harry Halloran is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of American Refining Group. He's also the Chairman and CEO of ARG Resources. Mr. Halloran is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in civil engineering. After graduating, he entered the Augustinian Seminary for 4 years and earned an MA in theology. Mr. Halloran is the founder and CEO of Energy Unlimited, Inc., a company involved in the renewable energy field, and has served on the board of the American Wind Energy Association. He is also the founding trustee of the Enlightened World Foundation and the Halloran Foundation, and serves on the board of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies. Mr. Halloran founded Halloran Philanthropies in 2007 with the belief that business is one of the most powerful and important drivers for positive social change.
Harry, this is Greg. Welcome to BetterWorldians Radio.
Thank you, and glad to be here.
Great. So today we'll be speaking about this book, The Pursuit of Human Well-Being. But I know in many ways it begins when you founded Halloran Philanthropies in 2007 with the mission to, quote, of creating the world we all want. So I wanted to ask you first as we get started, what would that world look like? And what inspired you to help bring it about?
Well, first of all, there's an interesting little story about this creating the world that we all want. My good friend Tony Carr, who is the president of Halloran Philanthropies, introduced the phrase, that the world we all want, not just the world that Harry wants or not just the world that Greg wants, but the world that we all want. That brings everybody into the picture. Mm-hmm. And so Tony said, well, our mission is to creating the world. I said, now, Tony, the mission is helping to create the world that we all want. We cannot create the world that we all want. So just to straighten that out, that we are hopeful to play a role, and we see some evidence that some of the things we're doing are helpful in making a better world. But and the world that we are hoping to help create is a world where everybody in the world enjoys the good life, or much closer to the good life than many people in the world enjoy today. And it was Buckminster Fuller who had this similar type of idea, and we've been in touch with the Buckminster Fuller board. The 100% world. By that he means 100% of us, not just the 35 or 40 when he made this statement. We think it might be higher now, but anyway, enjoys the world and health and a good life and education, and the wherewithal to make a good family life and support the good things going on. So that's what we are, among others, many others, some of them much bigger than us. We're part of that, and we feel very good about that phrase, and that we're reaching out, and that this work we think is helpful in realizing that.
I think that's a great, important story, actually, because it's not just that it's not only on Harry and Tony and your team to change the entire world, but I think it points to the fact that to bring about this world we all want, it's something that we all have to be a part of. And it's a grand story that I think that's told in this book, and it relates to that very idea that we have to work together, and that working together is how we really accomplish great things.
Right.
So I know it was just a few years ago that you launched this truly and extraordinarily ambitious research and book project that resulted in the publication of the 800-page The Pursuit of Human Well-Being, The Untold Global History. So why was it necessary to develop, as you say in your preface to the book, a deep understanding of the history of well-being in order to create the world we all want?
Well, there was a video taken at the time when we were starting the project, and the person who was interviewing me asked me this question: well, why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. And part of the answer was, and it was represented in the foreword, that when you think about it, if assuming that most people, and certainly we, are interested in improving the world, like the show does, a BetterWorldians Radio show that we're on, we're all, a number of us really, in fact, a lot more of us than people think, are interested in a better world for their children, for their grandchildren. And if since so many of us are interested in that, it raises the question of, well, what's going on now?
Right.
Where are we now? And then furthermore, if you're going to speak intelligently about the future, which we were interested in doing a plan, how do we do a plan or a series of scenarios which take us or help us to see the path to the world that we all want? How can we do that intelligently without knowing the situation today, by examining the data of how far are we away from this world that we all want today? Mm-hmm. And even more importantly, what about the history, and has the world been improving or not? Because if the world has been improving in health, education, and welfare, the three basic criteria of human existence, then that's one thing. If it's been improving, then we have a much better chance of getting to the world that we all want than if the opposite were true. If the world has gotten worse in health, education, and welfare in some of the countries, or all of the countries, or most of the countries, then obviously it's a much tougher task, and will lead to more pessimism than optimism. And that history has never been told. So we subtitled the book that it was a global history, but it was the untold global history, because it has not been told, because you don't see in the press, the newspapers, or the internet, there isn't any source which has really gotten into the data as we felt we had to in this project. That you have to have the data, you have to have a consistent story, and you have to be very honest with the things that you don't know and those things you do know. And so that was what we felt it was worthwhile to invest the money, find the editors, the wonderful editors that we have found, and to use them to help find the right authors. It was a collaborative project, very unusual in academics, for the funder to have a collaborative relationship with the editors and the authors. And so we felt that we had to do that presuming that the editors and we were in agreement with the theory and the way we go about the book, and we have achieved that, we feel, in the work that we now have completed.
I think there's a lot of really important insights there to unpack, actually. Just kind of going backwards for the moment, one of the things that's valuable to us at BetterWorldians is taking kind of a transdisciplinary approach to problems. We try to combat this notion of making it a better world from a lot of different angles, from faith and spirituality to technology to impact organizations and others. And, what I hear you saying there is the need to, they say in transdisciplinary research that part of the trans is both inside and outside the academy and inside and outside the sciences. And I think that what you've done is try to take some traditional research models, but also bring yourselves in and the vision you had and have a creative dialectical movement happening that brought about something that was really unique and really important. So that's the one thing that I really wanted to call out first. Also, I really do think it was so essential that you tried to combine both sort of ancient philosophies and world religions and everything that entire kind of ancient history and global cultural history of well-being kind of came up with, those cultural innovations of sorts. But then also say, okay, well then what can modern science and then the research show us, and what does the data reflect? So I think that's kind of an important pulling together of two very different but very essential insights.
Yes, and when you think about it, the reason why this is such a breakthrough study is that the media and the internet, they just don't provide the money, the research dollars to dig deeply into the data as we did. Fortunately, we were able to have enough money to fund the authors, to fund the editors, to pay the expenses, the publisher, which is one of the best publishers in the world, Springer, for these kinds of works, got solidly behind the project after they learned more about it. And you need all of those things, and you need to do the research. And if you don't do it, we had some hints from some of the projects that we're supporting in different parts of the world, in Africa and in India and in Latin America and in the urban areas of the United States, Philadelphia and Camden in particular. We had some hints there that there were a lot of good things going on that just simply were not reported. And so it gave us the courage, really, to think that by spending this money, we had reason to hope that we would find not as good a story as we did find, but at least a story that most countries, we were hopeful, have made progress.
Now, I want to come back to something you said that I think is also very important. With the subtitle of the book being The Untold Global History, that's a reflection on the fact that, unfortunately, many people today believe the world's actually getting worse, while quite the opposite may be the case, as the book uncovers. And we discussed that with Tony in the next segment. But why do you believe people have this negative view, and how do we counteract it?
Well, I think it's very understandable. Still, I'm one of those older people that still read the papers and the New York Times every day. Unlike my sons that have other ways of getting information. Right. But and you read any issue of the New York Times, which is one of the better publications, at least I think. Forget the political biases for a second. But because that's not really relevant. What's relevant is they present. There's lots and lots of stories of difficult things going on, in the terrorism front and environmental issues, in politicians being accused of various and sundry things, of all kinds of bad news. There's so much to choose from that the editors have to, choose the most enticing stories. Sure. And if one of their writers brought up, well, I've got this story I think should go on the front page of some good things that are being done, in Philadelphia that are pretty exciting. And they would say, "Well, you must be crazy. We're supposed to be selling papers here and interesting people and some important news items." And so that's not going to make the front page, that's for sure.
Right.
And may not even make the local page of the Philadelphia Inquirer or whatever. So it's understandable that people would have a sort of a very negative idea of what's really going on in society.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a case of and so many people, like a lot of the people that have supported, for example, the President Trump, were very much aware of the problems that exist in Washington among the elites from what they read, but they have no information on some of the strong positive things that are going on, believe it or not, in Congress. I mean, if you were to say to the average person that our democracy, despite its flaws, is really accomplishing things,
Mm-hmm.
and not perfect, but it's really accomplishing things, and they would say, "Well, what? Tell me what they are. I haven't read anything about that."
Yeah, that's
and so it's very understandable that people feel that way, and that was part of the reason why I felt it was important to fund this book, and I'm so glad I did. I see this as a base research book from which more popular versions and graphics and all that are going to come in the future, which is, of course, the same thing that Tony and I believe for the future.
Very interesting. I think that the root of the word news comes from, news stories or the news story. And what you seem to be doing here to kind of counteract some of the negativity we see in the media for various reasons is to say, no, let me tell you a news story. Let me tell you the news story of the great progress we've made, this untold global history that is unpacking and unraveling around us, and maybe we don't see it because we're not being told it, or it's happening in different parts of the globe. And I think sharing it creates that context for there is a story we can believe in that's different. There is a hopeful way forward that we can be a part of.
Yeah, and it's going to take a lot more to get this out into the public, which is really where it's going to make sense. More popular versions, graphic illustrations, things that will capture the attention of a lot more people than this academic work will, of course, is essential. But it's nice to have a research book like this, and the editors that we have and the authors that they were able to attract as a good starting place for for going forward into more popular versions.
No, I think that's exactly right. The stories obviously are based often on important facts, and we need the facts to start from in order to make a real determined difference in the world. But it's stories that inspire people. It's stories that convince people. It's stories that move people to action positively and negatively, and to positive action and negative action. And so I think as you expand what you've done, and I know you do have a lot of plans to do this, and bringing in different types of media, different kinds of applications and whatnot, different kinds of publications, you are basically taking what you've started with, which is so impressive, this 800-page book of data that tells its own kind of story, but letting people access it in such a way that they can get inspired and moved.
That is the hope, that's for sure.
Well, let me ask you this as we start to close up here, this segment. I don't want to steal from Tony's deep dive, and you've alluded to this a little bit, but if you could just make a statement, how confident are you at the end of this whole process that there is truly a reason to be hopeful and that there's a strong future ahead of us if we embrace it of well-being for all of humanity?
Well, I mean, my feelings and answer to that is that if you read the book, and particularly the graphs that are here in the book and the tables, and you look at, there's 180 nations that have made substantial and somewhat unbelievable progress, all 180 nations. Well, if that doesn't provide a background of hope for the future, I don't know what could do as much. And so that's the basis for creating a positive view of the future, which most people would agree that if you have a positive view of your business or your family or the future of what you're trying to do, your profession, whatever, you're going to do a much more effective job and the passion that's behind that is there. And so the hope is that this, plus getting help from other people and doing other projects as a follow-up on this, will give this optimism and positive view of the future and capture more and more people believing in a positive future for the world. That's the whole idea behind what we're doing, and we've got a lot of work to do before it reaches enough people in a convincing way.
Well, you're off to an amazing start. I encourage everyone at home to please pick up The Pursuit of Human Well-Being, The Untold Global History. It's available on Amazon.com. You may be able to find it in your universities or local libraries. It is, as we've said, an 800-page book of research, but it's very accessible. It's very hopeful, and it's very inspiring. So if you have a chance, please take a look at it. Harry, thank you for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio and sharing your vision with our listeners and with the world.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we'll get some interest from the listeners to carry on and work with us for the future.
We'll talk with Tony Carr, president of Halloran Philanthropies, in a moment, but right now I'd like to take a brief break and tell our listeners a bit about our sponsor, the uplifting virtual world game on Facebook called A Better World. A Better World encourages social good, positive mindsets, and giving back to social causes to make a positive difference in the world. Players in the world actually do things like share acts of kindness, express gratitude. They send get well notes to real-world sick children, and many, many more. Each month, the Better World partners with a different charity and challenges game players to do a certain number of good deeds within the game. When they do, A Better World releases funds to that monthly charity. This summer, they partnered with Miracle Foundation. When game players reach the do good goal, A Better World will release funds to provide a month of meals for 40 orphan children. You can find out more at betterworld.com. In this next segment, we'll speak with Tony Carr, president of Halloran Philanthropies. Tony joined Halloran as a founding member in 2007 after a career in hospital administration in Fresno, California. He served as the CEO of the first surgical hospital in the nation and the CEO of the first community-owned Heart Hospital in California. Tony is a native of Philadelphia and resides in Fresno with his wife, Lilia. And now, let's welcome back Greg and Tony.
Tony, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
So I want to start off this segment by asking you, let's talk about well-being. How do we define it, and what does it mean for us?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it forms the basis for our conversation, and it's fundamental to the project that we launched actually 4 or 5 years ago. That well-being is having a sense of a good condition of life, characterized by health, happiness, and prosperity. It's that combination of feeling good and having meaningful relationships and accomplishments in life. The UN defines well-being in an interesting way. The UN says that human well-being is a process of enlarging people's choices. Interesting notion. The most critical choice is to live a long and healthy life, to be educated, and to have access to resources needed for a decent standard of living. It's a great definition.
That is great. It is great. It's interesting how health, happiness, and prosperity are full of choices for us, and important choices that we not only make but need to be able to make, right? And I think that this notion of an increasing process of enlarging people's choices makes sense as a way of thinking about what well-being is, and that it has the conditions to be available to all.
Exactly.
Now, I know you just mentioned the UN. I know in the text a key measure for well-being is the United Nations Human Development Index, and looks at some of the things you just discussed: health, education, income, and wealth distribution, with actually the editor of the book calling it the new GDP. So could you tell us a bit about HDI, the Human Development Index, and the unique way the book utilized and even expanded that concept to include subjective measures like life satisfaction?
Sure. I mean, obviously, well-being has a lot more to do with human development than merely GDP or income. And in 1990, the UN created the Human Development Index, referred to as the HDI. The key indicators of the index are life expectancy or health, education, and income. These three indicators together are combined into a single index that's used to assess the overall level of human well-being in a country. So the Human Development Index takes all countries and then ranks them according to these key indicators. So, for example, the top 10 countries in the world, according to the Human Development Index, start with Norway. Norway tends to rank high on most programs assessing human development. So we have Norway, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Ireland, U.S. Interesting that Ireland ranks just a hair higher than the U.S. And then number 9 is Canada, and finally New Zealand. Now the value of this index helps countries begin to see where the countries are performing in terms of these key human indicators within their country, and also how they compare with other countries around the world. So every country then is ranked according to life expectancy, health, education, and income. Now, our main interest was to look at the progress or the lack of progress made by countries around the world. Every country in the world was part of our research. Again, based on these well-being indicators. The indicators of life expectancy, education, and income tend to reveal very unique patterns of human development. And they serve to monitor a country's progress over time in addressing basic social and economic needs of their citizens.
It's interesting. I like this notion so much of the Human Development Index because it speaks to the idea that we can't measure the development and success of individual countries only in terms of wealth. And obviously, prosperity and access to prosperity is an important aspect in this metric, and obviously that unlocks a lot for many people around the world. But it's also sort of saying, hey, we have to care more about just this. We have to look at happiness, health, education, all the things that make up kind of that life well lived in a fair and just society.
Exactly. To me, it's a more holistic, sort of human-centered way of looking at development.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Holistic, I think, is a perfect word. So I know everyone at home is listening are waiting on bated breath to hear about the individual metrics, but I'm going to draw it out a little longer and ask you, what did you find worldwide about well-being overall? Is there a reason to be hopeful, perhaps even excited about the progress we've made as a species?
The interesting about our research is that we didn't know then what we know now. And in fact, when we started this project, our focus was to develop a plan for the future of human well-being. And we sort of caught ourselves mid-sentence by saying, before we can focus on the future, we need to understand the past and the present. So that was a real interesting aha for us. And what we found was that there has been tremendous progress in poverty reduction, health, education, and happiness, particularly since 1980. We found that all regions in the world experienced significant improvements, particularly Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Progress was due in large part to globalization. Obviously, many other factors. But we saw globalization as being a driving force that encouraged business, government, and philanthropy to increase their funding for social and economic programs to improve the livelihood of marginalized communities. What we found was that there was so much sort of governmental cooperation that poverty is not like the solution for poverty and income disparagement is really, it's a global issue, and global issues need to be addressed globally through cooperation.
Yeah, it's the definition, I think, of good news, right? I mean, it's encouraging and inspiring because it shows that, across the entire world, things have gotten better at scales that we'll talk about in just a moment that are very, very inspirational. But that the fact that we were able to accomplish this as a species through global cooperation to really approach problems that are global in nature. And so I think it's an all-around good story that shows us if we work together, we can accomplish anything.
And I think one of the big impacts was that if we can achieve what has been achieved in this short tunnel of time, whether it's 20, 30, 40 years, imagine what we can achieve in the future. And again, to me, history is important to understand where we've been in order to get a sense of where we can go in the future.
No, I think that's exactly right. Now, I know there's been some other work, for example, Charles Kenny's Getting Better, that's highlighted some also hopefully hopeful trends in global progress. How does the pursuit of human well-being add to and expand on some of the work that's come before it?
Yeah. So several years ago, Charles Kenny is a British economist who works in Washington, D.C., and we discovered his book called Getting Better, which I think was published in 2011. And I was so excited by the book that I drove. That's so funny. I drove around suburban Philadelphia and purchased every copy I could get my hands on, and so I could share, the good news of his work. So he argues that significant global progress has been made,
right,
and that life in much of Africa and in most of the impoverished world has improved at an unprecedented clip in recent years, even if economic growth hasn't. So the biggest success, according to Kenny, he writes, has not been making people richer, but rather has been making the things that really matter, things like health and education, better, cheaper, and more widely available. I mean, he's not saying that money is not important.
Right.
But what he's saying is development that focuses on human development, health, education, really matters.
Yeah.
So we were clearly inspired by his work.
And how do you feel that? I mean, I know that the pursuit of human well-being is an 800-page tome full of just research from every corner of the world. It feels to me that what you have here and what you've added to the conversation is not only more data that proves the point out and then some, but also a sense of the global nature and the historical and contemporary platform from which we're really diving off into the future.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. When we started the project, we intended to publish a book of about 300 pages, and the goal was that the book would be user-friendly to college-educated public. We soon realized that there was so much research and so much richness in the research that really the 800-page book, which I call the Bible for human well-being, appeals more to the academic community, and as a result of that, we are working with the editors to produce or to publish a popular version of the book that will come out in December or January, and it'll be about 300 pages, and it's really intended more for college educated. But the other thing that's interesting is that there's been increasing interest in the individual chapters. So, for example, the chapter in Latin American chapter on human well-being, and so you can purchase individual chapters from the publisher. And what we hope to do in the future being 2018, is publish many books on human well-being, for starting off with Latin America, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, because this is not just a one-shot publication. We see this as a project that offers great information to the world, about the world.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's an excellent idea. Any way we can bring people in to the essential truth and important good news of this project, the better. But I would tell the people at home that if you can find the book at your local library or college, university, although it is quite large, it's very accessible, and it really warms the heart when you see the progress that's been made.
We'll talk more with Tony Carr, president of Halloran Philanthropies, and the exciting work that they're doing there in just a moment. But right now, we'd like to thank the players and participants in A Better World for reaching the Spring 2017 community goal in support of Integral Heart Foundation. The Integral Heart Foundation works in Guatemala to create conscious leaders through heart-centered sponsorship and educational programs, which include the development of mind, body, spirit, and emotions. Their school is currently home to over 80 children with 6 learning programs, a teacher training program, and it serves 1,500 meals and snacks every day. Since 2011, their programs have delivered classes and support to over 1,200 students and their families. They've also provided over 2,500 food baskets to our sponsored families of over 40 families. Due to the dedicated efforts of A Better World game players this spring, meals were funded for all students at the Integral Heart Foundation's new education center. So excellent work. Thank you all, BetterWorldians. You can find out more at integralheartfoundation.org. And now let's welcome back Greg and Tony Carr.
Okay, Tony, we've made them wait too long. Let's talk about some of the incredible findings. I'd like to start at the beginning of life and talk about improvements regarding infant, child, and maternal mortality. What did you find?
Well, the changes we see today in global health would clearly not be imagined, or would have been unimaginable among our ancestors. The health conditions of our ancestors were so bad at the turn of the century that many children died before the age of 5. And that we found that most babies born in 1900 did not live past the age of 50. Frightening but true. There were remarkable achievements in infant, child, and maternal mortality between 1970 and 2012, a span of only 42 years.
Wow.
As an example, infant mortality declined 58%. Childhood mortality, which is the death of children under 5, declined 62%.
Wow.
Again, this is within 42 years. Maternal mortality declined 27%. And this fact is a bit staggering, that there were 11 million fewer child deaths in 2012 than in 1970. 11 million fewer child deaths. We found that public and private sectors have made amazing investments in healthcare. Examples are in nutrition, urban sanitation, and vaccinations. Childhood vaccinations alone reached an estimated 86% of children. And vaccinations are considered to be, the biggest reason for the dramatic drop in childhood deaths. So world expenditures in health increased to 10% among all nations, and that the increased funding for healthcare was most notable in Latin America, in North America also, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. And I contend that the reason why nations have invested more in health is because of the sort of globalization and the sort of inter-cooperation of countries committed to improving, the health of their citizens.
It really is an astonishing story already. I mean, 11 million fewer child deaths, right? In only a handful of decades after, of course, a very long history of it being very much otherwise. It just shows what we're capable of. Now, I know there's been some gains, I believe, in life expectancy. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So life expectancy provides really a good barometer, probably the best barometer of health status within a country. This indicator not only provides us with information about the average years a person is expected to live, but it also relates to the condition of a person's health during their lifetime. The dramatic increase in life expectancy during the 20th century, I feel, ranks as one of the world's greatest accomplishments. That life expectancy rose to almost 72 in 2000, or by 2014, an increase of almost 20 years, just from 1960. But then you put life expectancy in perspective in terms of the year 1900. I know we were not all around then. My father was born in 1905 in Philadelphia, but life expectancy in 1900 was only 31 years.
Wow.
Imagine, 31 years. I'm 74, and I expect to be around for at least another 20 years.
It's amazing.
Maybe more.
I would be gone as well at that time. It's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. But life expectancy was only 31 at the turn of the last century.
Amazing. Well, let's keep going because the story builds. Worldwide poverty obviously is an area where many people think of when they're pondering global affairs and wondering what the state of things is across the globe. What did you find here?
Yeah. I think this is the biggest and the most important story that the world needs to hear. So the UN defines poverty as people living on $1.90 a day. The World Bank, which is connected with the UN, is the agency that is most concerned about international or the alleviation of poverty in the world. So in 1981, 40%, think about that, 40% of the world lived in poverty in 1981.
40%.
1981, my wife and I moved to Fresno, California. We had no idea that 40% of the world lived in poverty. Poverty now, or poverty declined to 10% by 2013. So from 1981 to 2013, within 32 years, poverty had been reduced by that amount. Another way of seeing this dramatic change in the world is that in 1981, 2 billion people lived in poverty. Poverty declined by more than 1 billion by 2013.
Wow.
Again, within 32 years. And it's interesting because most people don't realize that China alone accounted for much of the decline in poverty. And according to Bill Gates, China adopted a modified capitalistic system in the 1980s. I say modified, but nevertheless modified capitalistic system.
Mm-hmm.
And poverty in China went from 60%, a 60% poverty rate, to a 10% rate. Dramatic. So the reduction of poverty, along with life expectancy, is one of the greatest humanitarian achievements in history. It never would have happened without international commitment and cooperation, and I believe it never would have happened without the United Nations. So in recent times, more and more countries have industrialized and embraced technologies that have positively transformed their economies and many other aspects of civil society. So the progress in the reduction of poverty is particularly remarkable when you consider that the world population has more than doubled since 1960, from 3 billion people to almost 7.5 billion. So in a time of huge population growth, the world has managed to create more prosperity and lift more people out of poverty than at any time in history.
It's staggering. I mean, the numbers alone, not just in terms of how large they once were, but of course also, and more importantly, the changes we were able to make. And it also speaks to, as you say, not just the power of globalization, the power of the United Nations, but also the power of capitalism to do incredible good in the world.
You bet. So it's interesting that we have the human and technological resources to eliminate and eradicate most poverty in the world. There's this wonderful story about Muhammad Yunus, who is the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who stated that in the future, he said, we'll need to build poverty museums to display its horrors to future generations. They'll wonder why poverty continues so long in human society, how a few people could live in luxury while billions dwelt in misery and despair. I'd love to be involved in building the first poverty museum.
It's a beautiful vision. And I know that also he was involved in some of the earliest work on social enterprise, this idea that we could use capitalism directly for good, no notion of a double bottom line company. And that's something that we believe in very strongly in our sister company, A Better World, and the work that we do in trying to use gaming for good. So it's a powerful vision and it's a powerful method.
I think the beauty of Muhammad Yunus is realizing the sort of the power of one and the impact that one person can have on the world of 7.5 million, because he certainly has changed the world, and we can too.
That's right, we can too. So let's continue to move on, because this just builds with such power and hope. Literacy rate and education obviously are essential to moving people beyond subsistence living, even once they're out of poverty, and into a more dynamic and productive life, since obviously being able to read and learning about the world unlocks so many opportunities. What can you tell us about growth here?
So literacy, I'll talk about literacy and education.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're obviously important metrics to consider when looking at people moving beyond subsistence into a more dynamic and fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm.
And that none of the improvements in well-being would have been possible without the expansion and access to knowledge, and that governments and private industry have invested significant resources to educate their citizens. In terms of metrics, so enrollment in primary education has become almost universal worldwide, almost. And secondary education reached 74% by 2012. And, importantly enough, great progress has been achieved in the enrollment of women and girls.
Excellent.
And that education of women, I'm convinced, is the best way to save the environment. One of the most encouraging results in education is the progress in adult literacy. So in 2012, 85% of the world was literate. In 1900, that figure was 20%. So dramatic progress in education has occurred in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And the documented achievements in education confirm how life has improved in most countries, and that education and healthcare are two of the driving forces for change that increase political freedom and reduce poverty.
Incredible. Now we've spoken about a lot of these very real-world metrics, and obviously we're talking about huge changes with dramatic meaning for all of humanity. But I want to shift a little bit and talk about happiness. Obviously we talk about poverty, literacy, education, mortality. To a certain extent, one can say happiness, should take a second stage. But on the other hand, it's something that we all desire. We know this from the earliest philosophers and from the world's religions. It's part of who we are. It's built into our founding documents here in America. Tell us about happiness. Has that increased on a global scale along with these other indicators?
Yeah, it's really interesting how the trend or the interest in happiness has accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
And that, for example, when we designed, or we sat down with the editors and the authors around the design of human well-being, it was very clear that subjective well-being or happiness needed to be blended into the process. Now, the organization that has done more to emphasize the importance of subjective well-being or happiness on a global basis has been Gallup. They have done, and they continue to do, great work in measuring happiness by country and areas within country. So happiness and life satisfaction are clearly significant indicators for well-being. We don't have as much information as we do for education and health and income, but we have more information now certainly than we did 10, 15 years ago. So as I mentioned, Gallup and It's called the World Values Survey. Measure how satisfied you and I are with our lives each day. So there are daily surveys that are conducted around the world. So life satisfaction and happiness become central research areas in the social sciences. What we found is that in most countries, the happiness trend is positive and increasing. According to Gallup, and this I find really interesting, according to the Gallup World Happiness Report, 10 of the top happiest countries in the world are in Latin America. My wife loves this because she is from Colombia. And Latin Americans are known for their warm interpersonal relations, commitment to family, and interestingly enough, relative disregard for materialistic values. So these cultural characteristics play a significant role in explaining their sense of well-being and happiness. So Latin Americans are clearly the happiest people on earth, although the Swiss would take issue with my conclusion. So another measure of happiness, which seems simplistic, but I think it's meaningful, is how often a nation smiles. So a survey was conducted, and here again, Latin Americans came out smiling the best in the world. What I think is really encouraging by the happiness movement is the interest that it's gaining as a way of measuring more than income and health, but measuring sort of life satisfaction in a community. And we're beginning to see cities in the country conduct surveys to measure well-being, including happiness.
Well, it makes me smile. I think that right, it does. You know why? Because I think a happier world is a more peaceful world. A more satisfied world is a world at peace, without violence, or with much less violence than we experience today. So it's a hopeful trend for sure.
Right. For sure.
You've spoken about some of the drivers for these improvements today. Technology, globalization, capitalism are among some that you've discussed. What would you say are some of the other important things that have added to these incredible trends and these hopeful metrics?
Well, we found that, progress in poverty reduction, as I mentioned, health education, was particularly dramatic within recent years, specifically since 1980. And the progress is due, as I mentioned, oftentimes to globalization. Now, there are many driving forces behind the innovations in human well-being, during this period. Philanthropy clearly has been a driving force. Impact investing, organizations investing to make money and do good, which has been, I think, a potent force in the way investors are beginning to look at how to invest their capital. These are potent forces, particularly following the example or examples of Gates, Zuckerberg, Ford, Rockefeller Foundation. That clearly these foundations have made a significant commitment to human well-being. Not only through grant making, but also making investments to improve the livelihood. For example, we're involved in a consortium in Mexico, in Monterrey, Mexico, with a entrepreneur who's developing a chain of diabetic centers. So diabetes is one of the leading causes of death in Mexico. And he has opened thus far 8 diabetic centers, and it's a for-profit business. His goal is to sort of be the McDonald's of for diabetes in Mexico. And so what I'm finding is a number of people in the business of philanthropy who want to invest in improving sort of the health and livelihood.
Sure.
So these organizations are providing funding and leadership. It's not just money; it's money and leadership to innovate, sustainable business solutions, which is really encouraging to see the collaboration and the cooperation among people with wealth.
Yes. And it certainly is. And, I have one final question, and that's a question I asked to every guest, or that we ask to every guest at almost every show on BetterWorldians Radio. And let me try today to set this up a little bit differently. I think the story that you've told and that Halloran Philanthropies has been able to support and bring to the world through this research and this book project and the books to come is one where we see what's capable when we work together and believe in each other and truly see how a rising tide can lift all boats. Whether it's business innovation, tech innovation, nonprofits, philanthropic individuals, or whether it's across nations or across classes. When we reach out with open arms and open hearts, we have this ability to truly make a difference. And it's a story that I think is so important because it not only has all this hope and all this incredible just good news about what's happened, but it shows us the moral obligation we have to keep moving and keep these trends going and make a difference. So I want to ask you, how do you hope that this book project and all the other spin-off projects you have coming up will help to make the world a better place?
It's a great question. And let me begin by saying something about the power of the media, and that obviously which you're part of that power, and that the media really struggles to tell the stories of what's really happening in the world. Particularly when there are great stories to be told. So, to me, great stories need to be told.
Yes.
And that in a recent survey in the U.S. and the U.K., the majority of people said they thought poverty was increasing.
Right.
And it was kind of interesting because they thought that 2/3 of those in the U.S. said that poverty had doubled in the world. And that truly is fake news. I hesitate to use the word fake news, but
it is.
But another survey, and this was interesting. The question was, do you think the world is getting better or getting worse? In Sweden, Swedes tend to be more optimistic. Swedes said that 10% of the people interviewed said the world's getting better. In the U.S., it was 6%. Germany, 4%. So in this world of ours where we're sort of caught up in social and economic problems, it's so easy to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
And such a perspective tends to report, bad news. Not that bad news doesn't deserve to be known, but just in the work that we did on this small project, the improvements in well-being were remarkable, Greg. The reduction of poverty, the increase in life expectancy, the decline in infant, maternal, child mortality, near universal literacy, expansion of education, and finally rise in happiness were really astounding. And these were facts we didn't know before we ventured into this research effort. And it kind of ties together one of my favorite songs by the deceased John Lennon, who said, in two lines what I think is one of the most powerful expressions of human development, and that is, imagine all the people living life in peace. Yes. Imagine no need for greed or hunger. And I think that really ties in with the message of your mission and your purpose and your philosophy. And that we all, we are the beneficiaries of a healthier, a richer, and a better educated world. And just imagine what we together can do to accomplish better work in the future.
Absolutely. And it's a truly remarkable and astounding story, like you said. And what really jumped out at me from your closing remarks is this notion, great stories need to be told. I think that's something we should let reverberate across the globe. There's some evolutionary evidence. We've covered it in some of the speakers or previous guests on the show, that to a certain extent we are hardwired for negativity, right? Because we had to come out of the jungle and be on the lookout for the tiger behind the tree, and that sometimes contributes to a tendency to see the negative side of things. And I think the greatest stories across the world and down through history have been the ones that gave us a more hopeful picture, a more positive outlook. And it's because it's a story. Stories are how we convey meaning, and this is a story of great meaning and great hope. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing it today.
Well, this is wonderful. I really enjoyed being a part of your life and a part of your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony, this is Ray again. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great experience. It sort of sums up as our 128th or 129th episode, sort of so much of what we've done, because it really brings it all together and says, this is what we're talking about here. This is the progress that we're making, and the progress that's possible to continue to be made by all of us on this planet. So it's great work that you're doing it there. For our listeners, you can learn more about the Halloran Philanthropies by going to halloranphilanthropies.org. And you can also find The Pursuit of Human Well-Being, The Untold Global History on Amazon.com. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. You are really, and so is Harry and all of you folks over there in the Halloran Philanthropies, really, truly BetterWorldians. So thanks, Tony, very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the best in everyone. We believe it's essential to plant flowers and not just pull weeds. We focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the BetterWorldian in all of us so that we can all make it a better world. But we can't do it completely without your help, so donations support our BetterWorldians Radio podcast, as well as our hashtag Peace Begins Kindness movement to encourage kindness, decency, and civility online. So go to BetterWorldians.com and become part of this important mission. And until next time, everyone, please be a BetterWorldian.